Hi, I'm Rachel Person, the Director of Events for Northshire Bookstore, with store locations in Manchester Center, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and online at northshire.com. I'm so excited to get to welcome Freya Marske to our screens today. A little while back, our planned event as part of her book tour for A Power Unbound had to be canceled, and I'm happy that today we can still celebrate the final book in her wildly popular Last Binding trilogy. I've been completely obsessed with the series for quite a while now, smitten by its swoony queer romances, fantastic world building, and incredibly intricate plot. The series has become a massive Northshire bookseller and customer favorite. Freya Marske is the author of A Power Unbound, A Restless Truth, and A Marvelous Light, which was an international bestseller and won the Romantic Novel Award for Fantasy. Her work has appeared in Analog and has been shortlisted for 3 Aurealis Awards. She's also a Hugo-nominated podcaster and won the Ditmore Award for Best New Talent. Freya, thank you so much for making the time to chat today.
Hi, Rachel, and hello, everybody. I'm so glad I could do some kind of event to make up for the fact that we couldn't make it happen in person. So really delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. I thought we could start off, in case there's anyone listening in who is completely new to your work. Can you tell us a little bit about the series as a whole and the inspiration behind it?
Sure. Well, if you are completely new, apologies. Don't start with book 3. In short, the Last Binding trilogy is a series of historical fantasy novels set in Edwardian England, with each book also being a standalone queer romance, so different point of view characters each book and a different romance every book. At its heart, it's about 3 objects of power that have been unearthed and are going to fall into the wrong hands and threaten the future of magic in Britain, and a group of essentially queer found family who have to come together to stop this from happening. Very big picture stakes, but on a much more personal level, it really is about these 6 characters and a wider supporting cast, but their relationships and the journeys that they go through.
Lovely. One of the things that I hugely admire in your work is the balance that you strike between genres. These books are romance and fantasy and mystery and historical fiction all at the same time. So how did you approach blending those genres?
It was really a matter of necessity because I was always writing across multiple genres, and the blending process just had to be sort of carefully throwing everything onto the page and then, like you blend makeup, just sort of smoosh the boundaries together so that it does look like a beautiful cohesive whole. I knew that I would be writing fantasy with a capital F, in that if you ask a publisher where in the bookshop does it sit, then you have to have an answer in terms of a genre. And so these are fantasy novels first, but in my heart, they are romance novels also, in that the romances are just as important as the plot. And so that was always fun, balancing those plots as I went through. The murder mysteries wasn't something that I intended to do from the very beginning, but there is something very engaging about using a murder mystery as the scaffolding for a book and the hook to bring somebody through. So all of them have somebody die or have something terrible happen to them in the very first chapter. And you see the fallout from that across the rest of the book, which is something that I stole from essentially BBC murder mystery dramas, where you see the death before the credits. And in a book, this is a little bit of more of a risk, because you're introducing your book with somebody who's then not going to be a major player later on. But it worked in this case because I needed to set up some information for the reader that would then help to hook them and bring them through the book. So I've been teaching myself to write murder mysteries as a loose structure to hang historical fantasy on, and then to weave a romance through. It has felt like a bit of a balancing act for all 3 books, but because I enjoy reading all of those genres, I love a book that manages to combine genre in that way. So that's what I wanted to make.
Yeah, you really pulled it off. And in A Restless Truth in particular, it had almost an Agatha Christie feel to me, and that, like, the real closed door, everyone's locked together, the murderer can't have gone far, and I just love that so much.
That was a lot more deliberate in A Restless Truth, but much more than the other 2. I wanted to do something that was a bit of an homage to certain writers, most especially Agatha Christie, but also adding in like a real sort of zany ensemble comedy with a PG Woodhouse feel to it. And during the edit process, I actually had to go back and do some things to make it a little bit more Agatha Christie-ish. Like, I had to thoroughly edit some of the early chapters where Maud and Violet are going around telling the reader basically the layout of the ship. Like, what's on this deck? What's on this deck? Who can move here? who are the major players? Let's meet a whole lot of people who then could be suspects, which is a very, first 2 chapters of an Hercule Poirot novel. So yeah, that was something I had to go back and do deliberately to make the book fit together, but it was fun.
Yes, the fun really came through. Rereading the series, preparing for this conversation, I've been really struck by just how tightly and carefully plotted it is. There's so many little Easter eggs laced through the earlier books that tell us, we don't know it yet, what's going to happen later on. So what was your process to create that intricacy in the series?
So it was a 2-way process. Part of it was putting the Easter eggs in as I was writing the first 2 books, not necessarily knowing exactly how they would play out. Like I knew more or less what happened in book 3 on a very big picture level, but I didn't know what happened on a granular level. And so one of the things that I do when I'm writing anything, everything from a short story to apparently a trilogy, is the first half is me giving myself stuff to play with. So a lot of things went into A Marvelous Light and A Restless Truth that I thought, I'm not quite sure if this will be important yet, but it's enough of a throwaway thing that if I don't end up using it, it can just be color. And some things like the visions that Robin has in book 1, I had to think about quite carefully in terms of them reflecting things that I knew was either likely to happen or related to something that was likely to happen in the other 2 books. But mostly it was a matter of when it came time to write book 3, going back to books 1 and 2 and finding these things that I had left for myself, because I had to bring a large plot together and I had to solve quite a lot of plot problems that I had left for myself. And the best way to do that for me as a writer, and it may not work for everybody, is to go back to book 1, book 2 and start picking out spells or bits of world building or throwaway lines or characters that I put there, not quite knowing if I would need them, and then pick them up and say, how can I use this tool to solve this problem that I have left for myself? And that was very satisfying. And it did mean then that when you read book 3, especially if you've just reread books 1 and 2, a lot of things seem extremely deliberate and clever. But really what it was me looking back and thanking God that I had left these things for myself. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Did the opposite happen where you were working on book 3 and you were like, oh, I wish I had this to grab, or I wish I had done this some other way?
Not really. I think because like the first 2 books were out. Well, the first one was out and the second one was, on the verge of being out when I was writing book 3. There was not really much point in thinking, oh, if only I'd done X, Y, because I couldn't at all. But luckily, because the world building I was doing was quite deliberately not hugely sprawling. Like in the first book, you know exactly enough of the world building to get you through book 1. And in book 2, I give you exactly enough more of the world building to get you through book 2. I had left huge corners of the magical world unexplored. And so if I needed to, I could just tromp off into one of those dark corners and suddenly open the door to new magic, new ideas, parts of the magical world that I hadn't introduced before. And obviously there are still huge unexplored corners of the magical world. Like I was never going to be able to build it in every detail. So yeah, I think for me, it was just a matter of making sure that there were lots of unopened doors that I could walk through.
Do you think you ever will go back to this magical world?
I don't know. Like, I think, the fact that it's the world building I did of this form of magic could be used to tell different stories and different people's stories. And so it's possible, but certainly I haven't got any plans to return to it within my next set of contracted books, shall we say.
Got it. Each book in the series has its own standalone story, but the 3 also stand together really well as one large cohesive story. You're absolutely right. Anyone who's new to the work, start in the beginning. Don't begin in book 3. Can you talk a little bit more about how you built that momentum? Because it's something that is not always done very well. And you really sort of hit it perfectly.
Yeah, I think for me, it was about knowing how to fit story beats together. And again, I'm much more of a planner than I am an improviser, but I do like to allow myself some room to improvise. Because one of the plots in each one was a romance, I think the fantasy plot that goes across all 3 books, if there was no romances, if it was just that fantasy plot, it would not take up 3 books worth of space. It's not the most original a magical setup in the world. We have 3 magical MacGuffins. We have to find them all. We have to bring them together. We have to stop a dangerous ritual. You know, that could be a fairly short novel if all you cared about was the plot. So for me, I just had to divide that into sensible chunks while working out how I could fit a romance around each one. And it worked quite well because the first third of it really is discovery. So A Marvelous Light is about discovery of this problem and discovery of this conspiracy. And the theme of it really is Robin's introduction to magic, and the romance in it between Robin and Edwin is really one of quiet wonder and discovery as well. And book 2 in a trilogy is like the middle third, which is raise the stakes, get the action going. And so, you know, A Restless Truth has a different feel to it because it's much more of a, it had to be quite pacey. I had to have a lot happening, and I wanted it to feel faster and less controlled, like more chaotic than book 1, because that's what the middle act of a story should be. It should be where all the chaos happens. And then book 3 had to be about pulling everything together, you know, hitting the ground running, bringing everything together. So I couldn't introduce too many new central characters. I had to have all the characters on page already. I had to have all the pieces of the plot on page already. And the new things that I introduced in book 3 is really just setting and expanding the stakes and expanding the world and bringing everything to a point where it could end. And then I had to fit the romance in on top of that. So, you know, I think because I'd written The Marvelous Light, knowing it was the start of a trilogy, I'd set myself up for success in some ways, but it also really helped me to think about how each romance reflected the wider themes of the book and the part of the wider story that that book was telling.
Cool, thank you. What drew you to Edwardian England as a place and time to write about?
Boats, basically.
Okay.
So I always knew book 2 was going to be set on an ocean liner, essentially. So that's why I chose that. It could have, the story of Robin and Edwin and the magical liaison and the public service, that could have been set, you know, at the very beginning of the Victorian period. It could have been set in the contemporary world. You know, the setup of that didn't necessarily have to attach itself to a particular time period, but because I knew I wanted the, you know, Edwardian ocean liners like the Titanic as a setting for book 2, I started doing some research into the Edwardian era and what would make it a good setting. And I think in the first book, it's really, a lot of it's just social trappings and aesthetics that make it a good setting, that gives you that manor house party, that, you know, that great sense of the English manor house novel, and that segues nicely into this Agatha Christie feel in book 2. But then when we hit book 3, it becomes much more about the politics of Britain at the time. Like, it's set in 1909, and so I did quite a lot of research into what was happening in Britain in 1909 and what was happening with the status quo around classes and class structure and class mobility, what was happening, you know, very slightly in terms of the British Empire. I really didn't go into a great deal of detail there, but it turned out to be quite a nice, neat thematic echo when it came to these the trilogy's themes of power and traditions of power, and what happens when you attempt to question the status quo.
That makes a lot of sense. You've obviously done a lot of really careful research into the realities of the history of multiracial and queer Britain in that time period. Was there anything that really surprised you as you were doing that research?
I think a lot of it was really just around, it always surprised me and made me happy to find people who were doing things that we would maybe think of as groundbreaking, but for them it was really just part of, you know, living their life. Especially when I was researching book 2, a friend of mine got me onto the history of what was known as the first coloured opera company in New York, and I did some research into some of the opera singers there, and then based one of the characters in A Restless Truth on one of the main opera singers from one of those companies, and the same with when I was looking into the kind of theatrical community that Violet would have been part of in New York. When it wouldn't be called, it would be more the Gilded Age than the Edwardian era in New York at the time, but looking into what queer communities existed and the kinds of people that there were, like the actress Maud Adams, who was very clearly, you know, all of her major relationships were with women, and she was doing these trouser roles on stage. And it just made me really happy to find echoes of people who were living as themselves, despite the conventions at the time. Because I think when you're writing historical fantasy, or even when you're writing historical romance these days, there's this sense that your characters are slightly anachronistic because they are queer and happy, or because they are suffragettes, or they've got very modern ideas. But these people did exist, and they were finding happiness and community as queer people, and they were believing in social change and having arguments about it and joining the socialist society and things like that. So that was really nice, finding some real figures in history and not copying them, but knowing that these people were there.
Yeah. A historical fiction author I hosted in the store years ago referred to it to readers sometimes carrying bigotry backwards. That they would sort of say, oh, well, that couldn't have happened in that time period. She's like, no, it really, if you do the research, we were always there. This was always happening. It's just not in the history books because of who wrote the history books. Changing lanes entirely, can we talk a little bit about magical houses? Because I am completely obsessed with your descriptions of magical houses.
Always magical houses.
I don't even have a specific question. I just want to hear more about magical houses.
Oh, I don't really know if I have a specific answer beyond yes, more magical houses always, because it's always been a trope or a setting that I love. And I think in recent years, I've been reading more horror, which I sort of stumbled into sideways because I realized how much I love Gothic historicals and Gothic romances and Gothic fantasy. And of course, the Gothic is all about a house. Like there's got to be a house and there has to be a secret, a terrible history secret. Like, it's quite obvious if you look at A Power Unbound through that lens that A Power Unbound is a Gothic about Hawthorne's estate, and you open with the terrible secret of the house, and so much of it is about those secrets being quite literally hidden and kept suppressed, and then coming out into the light and wreaking havoc, but also clearing the air. And for me, the power of a magical house is quite similar to the power of a haunted house story, in that the house is character as well as setting, and it tells you something about the power and the relationships and the history of the people in it, as well as just being a building. So yeah, if you show me a story with a great magical house in it, I will always love it. I think my favorite one most recently was Alex Harrow's Starling House, which is a fantastic Southern Gothic with a wonderful, creepy, semi-sentient house in it.
Nice. I recommend, if you want a sentient house, Thistlefoot. You should check out. It has a Baba Yaga's cottage as a sentient house on chicken feet roaming the United States. So
I've always loved that about the Baba Yaga, that one of my only science fiction short stories that I've ever written was a retelling of one of the Baba Yaga fairy tales, where the house is a sentient spaceship.
Ooh, that sounds amazing. I will have to look that up. To varying degrees, each book in the trilogy also features some amazing fashion and interior design. And I'm wondering, were you already in love with the aesthetics of the Edwardian era, or was that another thing that sort of came up in your research?
It really came up in the research, and it has overtaken my life, really. So I started to look into, okay, Edwardian era, all right, what was happening then, in terms of art, especially once I decided that art and design was going to be Robin's thing, and I had to know something about it and know what kind of art he would have seen and what kind of design was being used in houses at the time. I realized that like the William Morris school of arts and crafts is something that I'd also almost grown up with. My mother was really into William Morris, and we had tapestries and embroidered cushions and things like that all around our house, and I'd always thought they were really like fuddy-duddy, there's this like old floral designs, why would you want anything like that? And now, of course, joke's on me, I have an enormous William Morris Duna cover, I have a William Morris cushion. I'm just recreating it all, thinking about the wallpaper, but it's very expensive. So looking into that, I think because I was going into it from the point of view of submerging myself in an arts and crafts movement from the perspective of somebody who was living in it and loved it, I think I just tricked myself into adoring it. And then, of course, it was a little bit of a step sideways to looking at the Art Nouveau movement, which was like hot on its heels. And I've always really liked Art Nouveau. So that was an easy one. getting really interested in design. And now, like, I have this intense interest in early modern design movements, like the Jugendstil and the Glasgow School, and everywhere I go, every art museum I go to now, I always head straight for the early modern wing and just spend my time wandering around between 1900 and 1940. Basically, that's now where I live art-wise. So it has been a personally changing experience, but what I think made the act of writing the books a lot of fun, to really feel that I was getting my teeth into the literal fabric that these people were living in. And to a lesser degree with the fashion, like I've had a lot of contact from readers who are historical fashion recreators who have had a lot of fun with Edwardian fashion. And for me, it was really just looking it up and making sure I really had my head around the difference between Victorian fashion and Edwardian fashion, and what were young women wearing in 1908, and what would an old-fashioned old lady from the Victorian era have been wearing at that time. The male fashion was much less important because the characters cared less. Robin and Edwin don't give a shit about fashion really at the time, so that they will notice what people are wearing in as much as it's a class marker, or a marker of being in mourning or something like that. But of course, you know, Maud and Violet, having been brought up to notice a lot more about fashion, especially Maud loves noticing what people are wearing, and Violet notices things because she has begun to think of most clothing in terms of costume, and she has a very theatrical slant to her mind. So I did a lot of research into the many layers that one would put on as a young Edwardian woman, and then you'd have to take them off again if you were going to have sex with a young Edwardian woman. So that was a bit of a headache sometimes, but you know, a necessary research.
Yes, absolutely. One of the really lovely developments over the arc of the whole series is the creation of a found family, which is always a really big theme in queer literature. Was the found family something that you mapped out as you were planning the series, or was it something that developed and sort of surprised you as you went?
A little bit of both, I think. Like, I knew that I would be slowly growing my core cast as it went along. I think I didn't quite know what shape it would take at the end, like whether it was just going to be a loosely linked friendship group who had gone through a lot together. And, you know, we queer people, we travel in packs, we tend to create friendship groups full of queer people. But I think the thing that transformed it from a queer friendship group to a queer family was Maud, because Maud surprised me with a tendency to just adopt older brothers if she came across anybody that she even slightly wanted to spend time with. Okay, you're my older brother now, off we go.
Yes.
So Maud was really the glue holding everything together. And in book 2, that's very deliberate. Like, she was very, I think, consciously exerting her charisma in a way that she hadn't necessarily done before. She was discovering her charisma and using it to bring people together. And then by the time you hit book 3, you have a group of people who are finding their balance. They've been brought together. There's a certain amount of stickiness from the situation that they find themselves in. But I had to show that these are people who are going to choose to remain in one another's lives through love, even when the crisis is past.
In book 3, I think it's Jack who at one point is like, well, all of us would clearly just follow Maud into battle anywhere, whatever she needs. We're good. And I was like, you know what? Me too. I would also follow Maud wherever she's going.
Yeah, and that was a part that I always knew was going to be a part of Maud's character. Like, when I think the book, it will sound weird, but one of the books that was most influential to me to writing Restless Truth was one of the earliest books in the Vorkosigan space opera saga, which is called The Warrior's Apprentice. And it's about a young man, I think he's 17 at the time, who has that unconscious charisma and ability to motivate people and bring them together and make them do wild things that they would not necessarily choose to do, because of the force of his belief and his personality. And I think you see that often in male characters, and I wanted to give that to a female character. So I gave it to Maud, and the character of Miles Vorkosigan calls himself Naismith in that book, which is his mother's maiden name. And Naismith is a name that means maker of cutlery, like somebody, a smith of like knives and forks. And so I gave Maud she assumed the surname Cutler in that book, which was a nod back to the fact that I was giving her Miles Vorkosigan's journey in that book, at least.
That's amazing. Um, That actually brings me, I was going to ask a little later, but that's such a perfect segue. What are some of your literary influences that sort of shaped this series as you went?
Yeah. Well, so I think I had discovered the Vorkosigan saga around the time I started writing them, and I have enormous respect for Lois McMaster-Bujold's writing, both in science fiction and in fantasy. I think she has an amazing knack for very real characters in very difficult situations. Her books are funny, they're propulsive, they can zoom from like, you know, very comedic situations to immense chaos to gutting emotional situations, and I want to learn how to do that. I think a big influence on me, even though it's harder to draw a direct line to it, is Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. I think that was something that I just read and read and read and read, like starting from the age of 10 up till now. I will still reread 2 or 3 of them a year. Just absolutely my favorite series. And I think more recently, books that have had an influence on the series, anybody else who's working in historical fantasy, like I love Naomi Novik's sort of fairy tale historical fantasy and the Temeraire series. I really love Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown, which is sort of Regency magic. Again, a great mixture of plot and history and magic and romance in that. Connie Willis's To Say Nothing of the Dog was a really big influence again on book 2, but I think any kind of manor house story, you know, a complete zany romp with a bit of magic, except, you know, in the form of time travel, science fiction rather than magic, and a romance, and just a really fun voice that just pulls you through the whole thing.
But To Say Nothing of the Dog is an all-time favorite of mine. It is.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely one of my comfort reads.
Yes, exactly. Each of the 6 point of view protagonists has a really distinct narrative voice. And so I was wondering how you develop your characterizations to keep those voices so distinct from each other.
Yeah, my trick here is giving them hobbies, or at least things that they are interested in. So I think just compared to the way that some authors do voice and like either very tight third person perspective, which is what I'm working in, or even first person, which is even more voicey. I think my voice across the series is still me. Like if you opened to a chapter, it might take you like half a page or so to work out which character we're actually in, because the narration voice is more or less the same. But the thing that really pulls people apart for me is what are the lenses through which they see the world. So Robin in book 1 always sees things, his metaphors are all either sports or art, and he thinks about things, frames them in terms of his own experience, you know, the family he's grown up with, the kind of society he's moved through, but also the interests that he has. And Edwin thinks about everything in terms of science or magic or books, because that for him is the framing narrative of his own life. Everything that he thinks about he compares it to something in a much more academic way than Robin does. And so his chapters probably have a lot more internal narration because he's just thinking more, to be honest. And then, yeah, and for Violet, it was really theatrical, always thinking about things in terms of people playing parts and being suspicious of their motives, and yeah, costumes, theatre. That was her framing thing. And Maud's was a little bit more chaotic, but they actually didn't have one interest. But I think I leaned very hard on the things that she believes. Like for her, the conscious choice of morality, and again, that world she's grown up with, and comparing everything to what her mother would think, and then moving in the opposite direction, sometimes in a detrimental way. And then, of course, you hit book 3, and you've got Alan, who thinks about things in terms of writing, but also is coming from a completely different social context and set of priorities to everybody else. So for me, I have to understand the character quite well when I first start writing them. And as I write them, I will learn a little bit more about their interests, their hobbies, the way they view the world. And then my edits often will be in refining that just on a prose level.
So each of those characters also have very different reasons for joining the sort of central conspiracy for good that they're in the middle of. Sometimes even like at the beginning, some fairly shallow or even selfish ones. So what was sort of your thought process around developing the moral calculus of each of your characters?
Yeah, it was an interesting one about how do you drag people into a plot and give them a good reason to stay, I allowed myself maybe one coincidence per book, really. So like the inciting incident of Robin being accidentally named to the magical bureaucracy, that was the one big accident I was allowed. Like that was a true coincidence. There's nothing like, it wasn't, there's no sort of, you know, destiny about that. It was literally just an accident, and everything that spirals from there happens because of choices that are made. And I think for him, I had to tie him into the plot very tightly and tie him and Edward together very tightly to begin with. And that was the curse that was laid on him. Like I had to give him a ticking clock and a danger and a reason for him and Edward to be trying to solve something together, which kept them together for long enough that by the time the curse was no longer an issue, there were other reasons that they were going to be staying together and trying to solve more of this mystery. For Violet, that was an interesting one. It was an interesting calculus because she's somebody who at the time of the book was not in the same way as Hawthorne going to be like, no, don't want to be involved. No, not involved. But she had to have reasons, and playing with her motives was one of the hardest things in that book, because she was at a place where she would do something for fun, but if it started to get serious, she would probably back away. And so again, I had to walk a delicate line between making her do something for fun, but then when it starts to get serious, revealing that actually there is a reason why she was in Robin's business. There's a reason she was always going to be part of this. And by the time she realizes that, she also has developed feelings and has other reasons for sticking around. So everyone is drawn in initially in a way that means they still have the chance to walk away. And my trick was making it impossible for them to walk away, which is how you do the hero's journey, more or less. Anyway, you have to say, okay, there comes a chance where you can say no to the adventure. And the trick with the author is to say, let's get you to a point where you're going to say yes to the adventure.
Can you talk a little bit about how your time spent in fan spaces and with fan fiction has influenced your work as a writer?
This is another one that I think is quite difficult for me to articulate because I'm so close to it. Like, obviously, I spent many decades writing fan fiction and reading fan fiction, and most of what I wrote was fan fiction for a really long time. So obviously, it influenced the voice that I have. I think, and it influenced the types of stories that I like to read and write as well. Obviously, like, you know, I think if I had come up completely through fantasy and science fiction, then I would have always known that I liked romantic subplots, but I might not have learned as much about the craft of writing romance as if I hadn't been introduced to the romance genre, or read and written so many romantic stories in fan fiction itself. And, you know, fan fiction is very commonly queer, commonly very explicit in terms of the sexual content. And because that was the norm in what I was writing, I became very comfortable thinking, well, that's just the kind of story that I write. And when I moved sideways into traditional publishing, I just carried with me all the stuff that I enjoyed writing and went, well, let's find out if there's anybody who will publish this. It's a very different type of writing. Like, I think some of the skill set is the same, but I have to approach it quite differently in terms of, you can't assume anything about the audience's emotional investment. In fan fiction, very easy. Everyone knows who these people are. Everyone's kind of already rooting for them. And you have a lot more shared knowledge to play with and shared reference to play with. If you're writing something original, especially if you are introducing people to a new world and new set of characters, you haven't got that benefit of the doubt. You have to put a lot more work in up front. And yeah, so different skill set. But I think, obviously, I would not be the writer that I am today if I hadn't been writing fan fiction. I don't know what I would have been writing instead, but it would have been different.
I actually haven't looked. Is there much fan fiction of this series out there?
I don't know. I know there is some,
Awesome.
But I don't go and read it. So
I'm going to have to go take a look later. So for everyone watching at home, we are about to step into the world of spoilers. I've tried to keep things pretty spoiler free in my questions up until now, but I have a few pretty spoilerly questions specifically about A Power Unbound. So now is your chance. Hit stop, go away if you don't want to be spoiled. They aren't like deep spoilery questions, but they're a little spoilery on book 3. So you have been warned. First up, book 3 has the highest heat level in the series. And you're doing some really interesting work in your writing about consent in the sex scenes in that book. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you approached consent as you developed the relationship between Jack and Alan.
Yeah, there's a lot less specific. I think a talk about consent comes up very explicitly in Robin and Edwin's book. And it's very necessary there because I'm introducing the idea of contractual obligation and magic as contract and consent to have any kind of power worked upon a vulnerable person. And all of Edwin and Robin's romance is about vulnerability. And when it came to Jack and Alan, I knew that because of the nature of the kink that they were playing with and the kind of relationship they have, the consent would have to be there very prominently, but in a very different way. And so they're not sitting down and having a very long, complex discussion about it, but because they are playing with power imbalance and they are doing some things that probably do verge on consensual non-consent and a lot of role play, they had to make it quite clear between themselves where the boundaries were and what was fantasy, and that they were just doing this because we both find it arousing and we're having fun and we're playing. And where does that stop when the two people that we are in real life are also two people with a very strong power imbalance across a number of axes? And so they have conversations around what's real and what's play. And some of the most interesting parts of the book and the most interesting parts of their scenes, I think, happen when one of them either accidentally or semi-deliberately sort of pushes a little bit at one of those boundaries just to see what's going to happen. Like there is a scene quite near the midpoint of the book where Alan thinks he wants something in particular and he's like, well, you know, I've been pushed around before, this is clearly what will work for me here. And it's coming from a place of not being quite sure what he wants. And Jack reacts very badly to it because as far as he's concerned, Alan is breaking the agreement that they had, that this is something that only comes out of a sense of want and desire and play, and not out of real anger or real desire to hurt or punish. And so I think, yeah, it was important to me that they didn't necessarily have to have an impeccably negotiated BDSM relationship, but in both of their narratives, they do a lot of thinking about how they feel about their own desires and how they feel about the situations that they're in, but in a way that makes it clear to them and clear to the reader that they are equals engaging in a game of something in a way that is more interesting because of the power that exists in real life, but is not allowed to be poisoned by that.
It was very well handled. I was really impressed by how you wrote that with their very real power imbalances, not sort of impacting it. So, well done.
And like most of that had to come from Jack. I think like with something like that, it just had to be very clear that the person who had the power and also the fake power was determined to approach it in a very responsible way. And I had to bring Jack to that point through book 1 and book 2, because I think the reason he comes off as such an arsehole in book 1 and is such an arsehole in book 1 is because he is someone who is not using his power in responsible ways on an interpersonal level. And he has to be carefully worked into the plot and surrounded by people like Maud and brought back to a sense of his inherent decency and responsibility, so that when he comes across someone like Alan, he is in a place where he can take a step back and act safely in that relationship.
Speaking of Jack and decency and responsibility, there was the whole side plot around politics and parliament and the people's budget, which you alluded to very briefly earlier. Can you tell us a little more, for people who aren't as steeped in the time period as you are, about that sort of political time period and what was actually going on?
I think probably a lot of the details have left my head since the writing process, but that was one of the things that I discovered in my research that I was like, I have to use this in the book. Like, it's so interesting. Really, it being the point that at the time in mid to late 1909, the treasurer at the time, or the chancellor of the exchequer, or whatever, I can't remember what the name of the person was, but Lloyd George had put forward this proposed budget, which had got through the House of Commons, and it was a very, what we would think of these days as an extremely social welfare heavy budget, with this idea that maybe we should take responsibility for the poor and the working class, and that charity should not just be on parishes and individuals, that that the state should bear some responsibility for the welfare of its people in a very financial sense. And it also had a lot in there about taxing the rich, which is still relevant today. And so it was extremely unpopular with the House of Lords. And at the time, the question was, is the House of Lords going to veto this bill? Because they had that political power. And it was a very popular bill with the Commons and with the people. And if the House of Lords vetoed it, then okay, yes, the taxes could not be applied to them, but it was leaving themselves open to some saying, this is where our priorities are. What are you going to do about it? And what the Commons did about it was begin to curtail the powers of the House of Lords in quite significant ways. And so the conversation that's being had in the book is, are the Lords going to veto? And if so, what's the consequence going to be? And what happened was that they did veto it, and it led to some curtailing of their powers in the next year under that government. And I didn't really want to go too deep into the weeds. Like, I had that one scene at Westminster near the beginning of the book because it was such a perfect setting for Alan and Jack to be exposed to one another in a very political way, and for one another's views to become clear, and for them to both face some misconceptions that they have about the other, while embedding it in a conversation about power, which is a great sort of setup for the rest of the book. So I really enjoyed writing that scene and doing a little bit of digging into the politics. And I did a lot of research into the lives of working class people in Edwardian England, and managed to show a little bit of that in the scenes that we have with Alan's family, because it's really the first book where I was able to do that. Up till now, it's just been posh people all the way down, really.
I was also delighted by the relationship that developed between Adelaide, Robin, and Edwin over the course of the third book, and their fierce protectiveness of each other. Was that happy ending for Adelaide one of those things that was a plan for you from the start of the series, or was that something that surprised you?
That surprised me a bit. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with Adelaide. She was important in book one, but I didn't know how much I wanted to use her in book three. But I liked her so much, and I wanted her to play a role. But that specific happy ending of the idea of her marrying Robin, not just like, as a marriage of convenience for a queer person, but also doing something very specific with definitions of contract and magic, was something, just a solution that occurred to me when I was thinking about how I was going to put my pieces in place for the final showdown, more or less. But once it occurred to me, I really liked it as a very queer solution, essentially, that there are different types of love, that Adelaide is somebody who I think, in my head, I think we would describe her as asexual these days, and possibly aromantic as well. Somebody who, for her, family ties and friendship ties are very important, but she's never felt the desire to be married. But she exists in a society that expects women to be married, because that's what one does. And for her, the solution of being able to marry one of her best friends, and to have a family that way, while completely understanding that the relationship between Robin and Edwin is one that is romantic and sexual in a different way, but at the same time she's been working with Edwin for even longer. She's been working with Robin, and that they have developed a friendship that has its own shape and its own flavor as well, and the idea of the three of them forming this little family unit where every dimension is a bit different and has a different type of love, but no less powerful, was really, really nice for me, because I didn't want her to just completely feel like a seventh wheel who's just floating around completely unattached. I wanted her embedded in it, in a way that that her character deserved. So I really enjoyed doing that. And again, if you're writing a pure romance series, having one of your characters marry someone completely different is a little bit of a risk, but yeah, I had a feeling that people would go with me.
It gave me so much joy. It really felt like it almost cemented the entire queer found family together to have that marriage taking place in that way. We are just about out of time, and I don't want to take much more of your time, but I know that you had a really big announcement recently of what's coming next. So I was wondering if we could wrap up by you telling us a little bit about your exciting news.
Yes, and I'm very, very excited about the book that's coming out next year, which is called Swordcross, because Swordcross was the first novel that I ever wrote. It's the one that got me my agent. It is one that taught me how that I could write a full novel. And like A Marvelous Light and the rest of the series, it's both romance and fantasy. It's less high fantasy than some of my other books. I mean, they're historical rather than high fantasy, but there's no magic in it. There's no magicians, there's no dragons, there's no objects of power, but the world building is very social religious. So one of its most immediate influences, and where the title was an homage to this, is Ellen Kushner's Swords Point, which is fantasy set in a mostly magicless world, but it's all to do with politics and trade and the university and the idea of formal ceremonial dueling. And when I first started writing the book, I kind of had that idea of ceremonial dueling in my head, and it collided with a listicle I had found on BuzzFeed about the origins of wedding traditions and the idea that the best man was the person in your friends who could sword fight the best, because you were all wearing swords at the wedding. And what if somebody came along and challenged the wedding and like wanted to sword fight you for the bride? And I loved that idea. And I thought, what if that was a job? What if there's that something that you can just hire someone to do, because if your wedding gets sword challenged and you lose, you can't get married. And so that was the kernel of the setup. And from there, it grew into a story about somebody who has to get married for his family business, but ends up hiring as his best man someone who is actually a con artist, and they get off very much on the wrong foot. But the story is a slow unraveling of both of their histories and their secrets, while there's a lot of sexy sword lessons.
Awesome. When can we expect that?
That one is coming in fall 2024. I don't know exactly when. And hopefully the book that's coming the year after that is another completely different standalone secondary world fantasy as well. I'm still in the process of writing that one at the moment, but Swordcross is all done, all ready to go, and I am so fond of this story and those characters, and I can't wait to start sharing it with everyone else.
I also can't wait. That's amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. And hopefully if I make it back to the States in future, we can make something happen in person.
I would love that. That would be amazing. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Goodbye.